Welcome to the book of Philemon. I believe Philemon is Paul's most personal letter because it's written from him to a very close friend. I believe Philemon was one of Paul's very close friends who had been super important in his ministry, who had been super helpful in his ministry, and it was very close. And Paul, I think you see this in Paul's address to Philemon. He addresses him not as an apostle, but as a brother, as a friend. And so Philemon, I believe, has a little bit of a different taste to it than the rest of the books have. Philemon is an appeal, not from an apostle. Philemon is an appeal from a friend to respond rightly to a very difficult situation. And I think it's helpful for us to recognize the difficulty of the situation and what Paul is calling Philemon to, because the fact is there are going to be times when we're faced with very difficult situations and we'll be called to the same kind of response, and the response is forgiveness. That's what the book of Philemon really is all about. The book of Philemon is all about forgiveness. If you want the date and time, go back to Colossians and look at that again, because Philemon was written at the same time from the same place by Paul as he's in prison. What's important to know is who Philemon was. Philemon was a slave-holding Colossian. He was a very rich citizen of Rome who lived in Colossae, a very influential person. It's believed that the church at Colossae met in Philemon's house. Philemon's wife was very influential in the church, and Philemon's son, Archippus, may have actually been the pastor of the Colossian church. So it's very significant letter written to a very significant man by a very significant apostle. And yet you won't see any of that significance. You'll see friendship throughout the book as you read. What's happened is Philemon has a slave called Onesimus. Onesimus is a name that actually means useful. That's what he was named when he was a baby, was useful, because he was going to be a good slave. He's a boy, and boys are always useful. And so as a slave, he had no standing. He had no rights, he had no authority, he had nothing of his own. And Onesimus was a runaway slave. He had run away illegally from Philemon, left Colossae, and gone to Rome. And this is where it gets really neat, really gets really interesting, because in Rome, through the providence of God, Onesimus finds Paul. And at that point, when Onesimus finds Paul, he hears the message of salvation. He hears the message of the gospel, because Paul was never quiet. And as he hears the message of the gospel, he hears the message of salvation, he responds in faith and becomes a believer, becomes Paul's brother in Christ. And really, as he's there in Rome, he serves Paul, and he serves Paul well while he's there. And I don't know how it comes up, but it comes out that Onesimus is in fact a runaway slave from Philemon. And so Paul then encourages Onesimus that he needs to return. He needs to go back and make things right with Philemon. He needs to go back and acknowledge his sin against Philemon and ask for restoration and forgiveness. But Paul doesn't let Onesimus go by himself. Paul doesn't let Onesimus go and just work it out. Paul actually sends this letter of Philemon with Onesimus to give to Philemon. And what it is, it's a plea to Philemon to forgive Onesimus, to accept him back. But to accept him back, again, not as a slave, but to accept him back as a brother, and to see that Onesimus, who was not useful because he ran away, is once again more than useful because of a brother in Christ. He's a brother in the church. What's interesting to me is Paul doesn't ask Philemon not to have Onesimus as a slave. Paul doesn't ask Philemon to give him his freedom, but rather to welcome him back into the position that he had. So this is not a condemnation of slavery in this letter. This is rather an exhortation to forgive and to restore and to be rightly related with each other in the church. Throughout the New Testament, throughout Paul's writing, he regularly talks about the responsibility of masters and the responsibilities of slaves. And I think this is actually played out here in this book. There are 4 major players in the book, 5 if you count Paul. There is Philemon, who is the slaveholder. There's Apphia, his wife. Apphia, his wife, would have been the one who had charge of the slaves. She's the one who would have had the right to order Philemon, or correction, to order Onesimus' death if she chose. And so Philemon has not just to forgive himself, but he's got to convince Apphia also to understand this. There's Archippus, who is likely their son and is also the pastor of the church in his house. So those are, and then the fourth main player is, of course, is Onesimus, the runaway slave, who is coming back. As you read through Philemon is a basic lesson on true forgiveness. It's a lesson on what forgiveness looks like and what forgiveness does. I'll just walk through that real quick. Real forgiveness doesn't sweep a sin under the rug. Real forgiveness acknowledges wrong. Real forgiveness then deals with that wrong. Real forgiveness makes that wrong right, and real forgiveness reestablishes relationship and moves forward from there without distrust and without dishonesty. And so this is really a lesson on forgiveness. And if you walk through as you walk through the letter, read it with those things in mind, and you'll see that's exactly what Paul is calling Philemon to do. He's calling him to forgive Onesimus that way. The outline of the book is really easy. I think it's a 5-point outline. In the first 3 verses, Paul just greets Philemon. In 4 through 7, Paul offers thanksgiving and prayer. What I'd like you to do is compare Colossians 1, 4 through 7 with Philemon 4 through 7. You'll see there's a ton of similarity there. In fact, it's almost as if Paul wrote the books back to back. It almost feels that way because he acknowledges Philemon for some of the same things that and praises Philemon for some of the same things that he praises the Colossians for. It is really interesting to me. So just do that. Just take the time as you're reading Philemon to go back and compare that with Colossians 1, 4 through 7. And then Paul appeals to Philemon in verses 8 through 20. That's the meat. That's the bulk of Paul's appeal. And it really is forgive. Forgive Philemon. Welcome him back. Welcome him back not because he's no longer useful, because he is useful. Welcome him back not just as a slave, but welcome him back as a brother in Christ. And then Paul finally gives personal remarks to the church at Colossae and to those in Philemon's house. Again, it's a little bitty book, a really quick read, but I hope you take your time to really read and enjoy and learn the lesson of forgiveness, because we'll be faced with that. You'll be faced with that numerous times as you live your life. Thanks for reading.